In this two-part study, we'll take a look at some of the issues and concerns and approaches that you may want to consider when using translations to study the Bible. Since most people study the Bible today using a translation, whether in English or some other language, understanding how to use translations appropriately is a very important task when you're studying the Word of God. In the first part, we'll be taking a look at some of the background issues that shape the way that translators do their job. In the second part, we'll consider some of the more practical kinds of questions that you should ask as you employ a translation in the study of Scripture. The overall goal of our study is a simple one. We want to understand the reason why translations differ from one another and then understand how to compare them in a helpful way to help us understand the text better. Now, this is useful whether or not you can read the Bible in its original Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic. If you cannot read the Bible in its original languages, then comparing a variety of translations can help you understand the text better. If you can read the Bible in its original languages, comparing a variety of translations is still helpful because it can help you see things in the text that you might not have noticed otherwise. And it can also help you identify grammatical issues and questions that may require further study. Now, when most people approach the question of using translations for the study of the Bible, they tend to stop at the point of deciding which translation it is that they personally like better. And that's not really the point of comparing translations. The point of comparing translations is not to decide which you like better, but rather it is for the purpose of helping you better understand what the author originally intended to communicate when he was writing. So let's begin with a look at the philosophies or approaches that shape the way translators do their work. Let's begin with an obvious question. What is a translation? Basically, a translation is simply rendering a text that's written in one language into a different language. We refer to the language in which the text was originally written as the source language, and the language into which we're rendering it as the target language. So, a translation is rendering a text from a source language into a target language so that those who cannot read the text in its original source language can still have the benefit of reading it. Now, the goal of any translation is to communicate faithfully what the text says in one language in another language. In other words, it's to faithfully communicate the meaning of the text from the source language to the target language. But the problem arises because there's more than one way that you can approach this task. So the question is, what is the best way to do that? And to understand the way translators think about this, we have to approach the question of what we sometimes call translational philosophies. It's probably best to think of this as a kind of spectrum. And at one end of the spectrum, we have an approach that renders as closely as it can each word in the source language with a word in the target language. At its extreme, this would produce what we kind of call an interlinear text that may have, say, Greek and then the English equivalent below that. At the other end of the spectrum, we have an approach that is focused on not on rendering each word individually, but rendering the thoughts of the text. So, this kind of thought for thought approach. And at the extreme end of this approach, we have what we would sometimes call a paraphrase. Some people don't regard paraphrases as translations at all. Other people would regard them, as I tend to do, as the extreme end of one part of the spectrum. So this produces two different approaches to translations. And translations are not all of one or all of the other. They tend to fall along the line of the spectrum that we were looking at a moment ago. So there are two elements that one must consider when evaluating a translation. One is what we might think of as the syntactical aspect. It's the way that the translator renders the grammar and syntax of the source language. The other concern is what we might think of as the lexical aspect. How does the translator approach the task of picking a word in the source language that reflects, picking a word in the target language that reflects the source language? So let's deal with the syntactical aspect first. As I said, here the question is, how does one best render the grammar and syntax of one language into the grammar and syntax of another language? The lexical aspect then would be, how does one choose the best gloss in the target language to reflect the word that's in the source language? So let's begin with the syntactical aspect. And again, we can think of this as a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, we have what we typically call formal equivalence. Formal equivalence is rendering the source text into the target text on pretty much a word by word basis as much as possible, employing a gloss in the target language for the same type of word in the source language. So you would substitute a verb for a verb and a noun for a noun and an adjective for an adjective. And at the extreme end, you would do this as uh, as closely as possible. And as a result, a translation done this way will reflect as much as possible of the word order and the grammatical structure of the source language. At the other end of the spectrum, we have what we might think of as dynamic equivalence translations. Translations that follow this approach tend to render the source language in the target language in an idea by idea way or a thought by thought way, in order to express the ideas of the source text in the target language without necessarily being concerned to represent it um, in the strictest way in terms of verb by verb or noun by noun and so forth. And the key here, when you're producing a dynamic equivalence translation, is to try to render the language in what we might think of as the natural idiom of the target language. In other words, if you're translating into English, you would want the translation to be good contemporary English. This produces a translation that will focus on saying the same thing that the source language says in the best English of the day, assuming, of course, you're doing English translation. So, when it comes to the syntactical aspect, we have a formal equivalence approach that tends to produce a fairly stilted style and stiff or wooden sort of style, and a formal equivalence approach that tends to be easy to read but does not represent the underlying structure of the original text as clearly. So that's the syntactical aspect of translation. Now let's move to the lexical aspect. In the same way, we can think of this as a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, we have what we might think of as etymologically driven approach to the choice of words. In an etymologically driven approach, the translator will select a gloss in the target language to substitute for the word in the source language based largely on the history of the use of both words. In other words, it tries to find a language, pardon me, tries to find a word in the target language that has, as much as possible, the same sort of history of usage that exists in the in the source language. At the other end, we have what we might think of as a significance driven approach. In a significance driven approach, the translator selects a gloss in the target language that will substitute for the word in the source language based on the sense in which the word is used in the context. So he's not as concerned with the history of the words as he is with what's being communicated in this particular phrase. Let's look at an example from Hebrew, from Psalm 7. And if you don't know Hebrew, that's all right. You'll still be able to follow the discussion easily enough, I think. So here's Psalm 7, verse 10. It's verse 9 in most English translations because the verse numbers are off. It reads, and here we'll translate it fairly woodenly, fairly stiffly here for the sake of this exercise. Um, so the first phrase would be rendered something like, "May the evil of the wicked come to an end." And then the next phrase would be something like, "And may you establish righteousness," and, or perhaps the "and" here indicates a consequence, and so we might render it as "since" as well. And then we would kind of skip down to pick up the subject, which is next. "Since you are a righteous God," and now we have an adjectival or participial phrase describing what this righteous God does. He is one which tests or puts to the test. Um, and now we have two words we have to figure out how to translate here. These words we'll leave undefined for the moment and then take a look at them. And these will illustrate the problem of lexical approaches. So the first word here is the Hebrew word lave. In an etymologically driven approach, the translator would look at lave and say, okay, lave is the normal word that refers to the part of the body that we call the heart. And so an etymologically driven approach would almost certainly render this heart. On the other hand, someone who's approaching the text from the perspective of a significance driven approach to words would say, you know, in the ancient world of the Bible, the heart was understood to be the seat of thought. In other words, they didn't think that the mind was where thought took place. They thought that the heart was where thought took place. And so a significance driven approach might not translate this heart because that would be misleading. The point is the thoughts that one has. And so um, a significance driven approach would maybe render this as thought or even mind instead of heart. And then in the next word, we have the same kind of problem with the next word. The next word, kalia in Hebrew, is the normal word for that part of the body that we associate with the liver in English. But again, in the ancient world, the significance of the liver in terms of the conceptual world was that it was understood to be the place where emotions were located. And so they an a significance driven approach would perhaps translate this not as liver, but as with some word that implies something like the seat of the emotions. So we have two different approaches that would yield us two pretty different renderings of this last phrase here. An etymologically driven approach might render them something like heart and liver, whereas a significance driven approach might render them something like mind and heart, because we think of the heart as the place connected with emotions rather than with thoughts. So let's look at how some actual translations render this phrase. Some older translations, the original King James, the Darby, and Young's literal translation, render this with the phrase hearts and reins, because reins, R-E-I-N-S, is an older word that refers to the liver, and not a word that we use much today. So most people probably wouldn't know what that word means if we used it. Some more recent translations: New American Standard, the New American Bible Revised Edition, the New Jerusalem Bible translates heart and mind. The Lexham English Bible translates heart and innermost being. The ESV, the NIV, and the New RSV translate mind and heart. The Jewish Publication Society's translation, the Tanakh, renders this as thoughts, as mind and conscience. And the Christian Study Bible and the God's Word translation render it thoughts and emotions. And the New Century Version renders it as thoughts and feelings. And the Good News Bible translates it as thoughts and desires. And the New English Translation renders it as innermost thoughts and motives. So we have quite a variety of renderings of this. You'll notice that some translations, um, some of the older ones will render the Hebrew word heart with the English word heart. I should say the Hebrew word lave with the English word heart. But the majority of the more recent ones take a more significance driven approach and translate it with mind or thoughts or something like that. And the second word is a little more difficult. There are a lot more variety here between reins, which is an old word for actual liver, and then nobody else actually translates it as that literal sense of liver. It's always mind, in some cases, or innermost being, heart, conscious, emotions, feelings. They're all trying to get at the little more significance-driven approach to this particular phrase. So we have these two elements then: the syntactical element, how you represent the way words are grouped together and related in both languages, and the lexical element, how you go about choosing particular glosses or words in one language to represent the words in another language. Now, if we want to compare translations, we could create a chart, and on the chart, we could have a horizontal scale, which would compare the formal and dynamic equivalents of the syntactical translation. And then on the vertical scope, we could have um, a scale which represents the lexical choices between significance driven and etymologically driven. And when we combine these, we would end up with a diagonal. And on that diagonal, in relation to that diagonal, we could place where modern translations fall. And so if we were to do that, we would find that most of them are either going to be some combination of formal and etymological, or they're going to be significant and dynamic. Most of them will go in an approach that prefers one of those pairs and the other pairs. You don't see a whole lot that are mixed together, and you almost never see any that use a dynamic approach for syntax and an etymologically driven approach for selecting words. So if we were to lay out along this chart a number of modern translations, and this is just my own personal judgment about how these translations work, we would see that they fall largely along this dynamic in two groups with a little bit left over. So um, at the lower left, we have those translations that are most formal in approach to syntax and most etymological in their approach to grammar. So we have the original King James, the Authorized Version, and the New American Standard. And close to those, the RSV and the ESV. Now we get, as we move along the diagonal toward the other corner, we get some translations like the NIV. And the NIV is interesting because the original NIV was more significance driven. The NIV 80, I'm sorry, pardon me, the original NIV, the NIV 84, tended to be pretty much right in the center and be a little more etymologically driven with regard to its word choice. And it strikes me that the newer version of the NIV that's available today has moved a little bit in the direction of more significance driven choices of words. Um, the new RSV has done something similar. The original RSV was much more etymologically driven in its selection of words, and the new RSV tends to be more significance driven. They're about the same place in terms of their handling of syntax, but in terms of word choice, there's been a significant shift along the scale. The New American Bible is kind of close to the NRSV in this sense, but not a huge amount to choose from. And then we have a whole grouping of translations that are generally significance driven and dynamic equivalence driven, but not extremely so. So they fall, kind of together in a group along the scale just to the upper right of center. And then, kind of out a little further, we have the New Jerusalem Bible, which is a little more even dynamic and significance driven. And then finally, we get the things that most people would think of as paraphrases, the Living Bible and the Message, which are extremely significance driven in terms of word choice and very dynamic in terms of their choice of phraseology. So you can see how these two factors come together to shape the way that translations approach their task, and that in turn is reflected in their translations of individual verses. So this would actually force us to ask the question, what exactly do we mean when we talk about a literal translation? Is a literal translation one that is more uh, syntactically strict or more dynamic? Is it more literal to be etymologically driven or significance driven in your choice of words? And most people would tend to think that the more formal and the more etymological a translation is, the more literal it is. But etymologically driven and formally uh, driven translations don't always necessarily communicate the idea of the writer or speaker clearly in modern English. And so it raises the question of if it's not actually doing a good job of communicating, is it really literal? So that's a basic and fairly quick look at what the kinds of issues that shape the differences between translations from the approach of translational philosophy.